story that you and I have talked about
Yeah.
previously, the RAF Bentwaters, the Rendlesham mystery. And what interests me about that case, which was an incident that took place at a nuclear base that the Americans and the British jointly operated in the United Kingdom, is that there were biological effects that were allegedly also described being inflicted on at least one of the people that witnessed this object landing in the Rendlesham Forest adjacent to this airbase, RAF Bentwaters, in the United Kingdom, which allegedly was nuclear armed. It was one of the main nuclear bases in the United Kingdom. And in December 1980, when Airman John Burroughs and his colleague Sergeant Jim Penniston went into the Rendlesham Forest to investigate an object which was seen descending into the forest, Burroughs said he only saw strange flashing red, green and blue lights in a clearing that threw off the image of something that looked like a craft, but he never saw anything metallic or hard. Penniston has described in great detail actually physically touching a craft, which he had almost had a sort of a smoky glass-like structure to its external structure with symbols on the side. But the takeaway from that case that has often been overlooked is that John Burroughs suffered terrible injuries. He suffered heart injuries that incredibly, in or around 2015, as a result of the intervention of the good Senator John McCain, Airman First Class John Burroughs was acknowledged to have suffered what apparently were huge doses of radiation while investigating this matter. And the US Veterans Association, the VA that looks after injured veterans, agreed to pay for his treatment after John McCain successfully helped him obtain his medical evidence to actually show that he'd suffered some kind of an injury during this incident. I think that's very significant.
Oh.
It's essentially a biological effect caused by a UAP, acknowledged by an arm of the US government.
Well, you know what's also interesting about that, Ross, is it was a holiday season to remember in late December of 1980, because not only did you have that case with Burroughs in the Bentwaters case, but at the same time, literally a few days later, here in the United States in Texas, we had the so-called Cash Landrum case. And while Burroughs actually won his legal battle, if you will, to be recognized and treated for his injuries, Cash Landrum turns out another way. I'm going to let you tee up Landrum while I look up the effects that some of these people suffered.
Okay, Cash Landrum is an amazing case, Bryce, because I strongly suspect Cash Landrum was some kind of US project. But what it involved was on the evening of 29th December 1980, which, as you say, is very, very close to the RAF Bentwaters case across in the United Kingdom. Betty Cash, Vicky Landrum and Colby Landrum, who was 7 years old at the time, were driving home to their home in Dayton, Texas. And all of a sudden, they came across a huge diamond-shaped object hovering over the road. And it appeared to be in trouble. It was emitting flame and emitting significant heat. So much heat that allegedly somebody's hand on the dashboard actually sank into the vinyl on the dashboard. And the family allegedly suffered very serious radiation injuries that were measured and assessed as real by doctors. And because they believed that the US military was involved, because there were allegedly a large number of helicopters pursuing this object that appeared to be United States military helicopters, they sued the US government, as you say. And unfortunately, they lost the case because they couldn't prove that the object that was seen was in fact a US government object, even though they were shown to have suffered some terrible biological effects from their exposure to this radiation. They couldn't prove definitively that whatever it was part of the US military that had caused these injuries.
Let's talk about those biological effects. There were large, painful blisters for one, and Cash went into an emergency room days after this because they didn't go away, and she could barely walk and had lost large patches of skin and clumps of hair, was released after 12 days. And it gets very specific. You said a lot of helicopters. There were 23 by the count of the Cash Landrum. I mean, if you have enough time to count 23 helicopters, you have to ask yourself, how often are 23 helicopters dispatched to do much of anything? But again, that case was not a win. It was one where the government was able to say that it wasn't us, which is kind of interesting. If you're saying it wasn't us, that doesn't necessarily mean you're saying wasn't anybody. It could be somebody.
Now, this is where it gets interesting, because a lot of people might be thinking, okay, those are historical cases of biological effects from UAPs. I'd like to talk about a more contemporary one.
Right.
I have a very personal friend, a very close friend, Damien Nott, who is one of Australia's foremost UAP researchers. He's gravely ill at the moment, very, very seriously ill, after he was exposed a few years ago to what he says was a UAP that essentially descended, and he'd been watching it for about 40 seconds in his backyard. It descended towards him. His girlfriend, Mel, was with him for a large part of the earlier part when he was filming and watching this object. She went inside. And then what he describes happened was that as he was watching this object, it essentially descended towards him very, very closely and emitted a huge flash of bluish light. Now, ever since that incident, which Damien told me about, he's got gravely ill. He lives in a small country town in regional New South Wales here in Australia. And his symptoms, his doctors tell him, are consistent with exposure to very weird radiation. They can't explain his injuries. He's suffering horrible sort of osteoporosis symptoms where his bones are very, very brittle. He has anomalous MRI scans. His brain scans show anomalies, which American experts that he's been in touch with from Harvard University who are involved in brain scan studies tell him are unusual. And this is a person who was exposed in Australia just to within a few years ago. And I can tell you the symptoms that he's suffering are very, very grave indeed. And look, if there's anybody out there, by the way, who's a doctor who actually knows anything about treating people with radiation injuries, Damien's very keen to hear from them. We're actually going to show in the vodcast, we're going to show pictures of what he says he experienced. But they are harrowing images for the first time people will see. He suffered blistering on his arm when he threw his arm up like this to protect himself from the bright light. And on the area of his arm where he was exposed, he suffered very grievous burns that essentially have got infected and bubbled up with some kind of infection. They're quite harrowing.
I've seen those photos. They are troubling. They're disturbing. And yes, we will put them up on the video version of this because Damien has told us it's okay to do that. He's interested in seeking the truth here and actually also seeking help if he can receive it. I wonder though, Ross, as people, because we know how easy it is to dismiss things or to deflect. You go, well, yeah, something really happened to that guy, but all we have is his version of events that this thing was landing in his backyard. Is there corroborating evidence of any kind that anything else can say, yes, Damien was exposed to something non-traditional out there?
Well, we know from his doctors who've actually examined him that they are baffled by his injuries. I mean, how does somebody get burns on their arm from exposure to some kind of radiation in their backyard? These are really anomalous injuries. And the interesting thing about it is that if you actually look and study what is being said by people like Professor Gary Nolan at Stanford University, Damien's the tip of an iceberg of people who are people involved in proximity to UAPs who have suffered injuries as a result of exposure to those UAPs. Professor Nolan, who's an extremely reputable scientist based at Stanford University, has described anomalous MRIs. He's actually described how the MRI of somebody who's been exposed to a UAP is very similar to somebody with multiple sclerosis. It looks like white matter disease. There's scarring. And this apparently is what Damien's been told he's got on MRIs that he's sent to doctors at Harvard University who are doing research. And if you actually read what Gary Nolan said to Vice.com, he actually has suggested that some people who've been exposed to these objects actually have shown enhanced parts of the brain as a result of their exposure to these UAPs. He's not saying that he's developed a hypothesis yet to explain what that means, but basically when you have brain differences as a result of exposure to UAPs, that's scientifically significant and it should be being investigated. But I think the most interesting thing, the most disturbing thing is that of the 100 or so patients that Gary said he looked at, a quarter of them died from their injuries. So these people who claimed that they'd had an encounter, especially pilots, were showing a decrease in neurological capabilities. And a quarter of them, Gary said, died from their injuries. And he actually linked it to essentially being similar to what's being now called Havana syndrome. So again, biological effects from exposure to UAPs. Maybe it's inadvertent, but maybe what these objects are, whatever they are, perhaps they're doing it inadvertently, but they seem to be causing health problems in some humans that come up close to them.
Which is the takeaway. And as we've said before, one of the things we want to do with this show is to explain to people who are just coming to the material what the breadth of this information is. Seeing unidentified aerial phenomena or unidentified flying objects, whichever you choose to call them, isn't just a matter of bright lights in the sky. There is a physical aspect to what people are seeing. And as Ross has just explained in detail, there are literally human cases where people are injured in what appear to be close contact with technology. Now, that doesn't mean that we're telling you whose technology it is, but there seems to be a fairly strong case that somebody's technology is, when exposed to human beings, very harmful to their health. And that is something that Gary Nolan, by the way, great interview. He's always someone who speaks very directly about this. Fascinating to hear from him. So yeah, more on this in the future as well.
So let's continue this theme, Bryce. Coming up next, in the next section of Need to Know, let's look closer at the military threat issue of UAPs. Coming up next on Need to Know.
We've got the right to choose it. There ain't no way we'll lose it. This is our life. This is our song. We'll fight the powers that be, just don't pick our destiny, 'cause you don't know us, you don't belong. We're not gonna take it, no!